Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet. It's a planet that is wrapped in turmoil right now and complexity and uncertainty. The human enterprise is been doing very well for a century or two. There's been lots of drama and loss along the way. And the changes right now on the planet are unbelievable. The global connectedness makes local situations, whether it's Ukraine or now Israel or the like, ramify in many ways. I'm Andy Revkin at the on the my Substack column is Sustain What? That's the name of this video series, which explores consequential complexity. What do we do when we're faced with complex superimposed risks and opportunities, and you can feel overwhelmed sometimes? Right now, today, I'm going to explore a disease, a mosquito-borne disease, dengue, which I experienced in 1979. I'd never heard the words retroorbital pain before. I had this experience when my eyes, dengue, the fever makes it hard to move your eyes side to side. And I was living on a boat at the time. I jumped in the water to try to cool off my fever, and I felt like my head was exploding from the pressure of going underwater. I was hallucinating. And that was a kind of a low grade version. There's hemorrhagic dengue. It's a disease that's spreading globally, I think faster than any mosquito-borne disease. We'll learn a lot more about it from Duane Gubler, who studied this virus and the insects that carry it, mostly the Aedes aegypti mosquito, and how to control the risk. And we're going to try to demystify some aspects of this. There's a lot of simplistic assertions underway right now. And I'm really glad to catch up with you, Duane Gubler at Duke University, but now you're living, I think, in the American Southwest,
Yes.
trying to be retired, but failing miserably because yeah, there's so much work yet to be done.
You sound like my wife.
Uh, so briefly, I'd like to get into your history. You've been at this for half of a century, right? Pretty much, right? Which is a long period of time. So tell us a little bit. Here's one of the a textbook you've written and a poster that was made to kind of chronicle your part of this fight. So just explain a little bit about how you became focused on this virus when you were a young researcher getting out of university and like what pulled you into the virus, this insect, and has stuck with you all these years.
Well, it's a long story, Andrew. I'll give you the elevator version of it. I did my training at Johns Hopkins in the last half of the 1960s. And if you're old enough to remember that era, it was a time when the war on infectious diseases was declared won. And there weren't very many jobs in infectious diseases, let alone vector-borne infectious diseases at the time. So, and I wanted to work in the tropics. I did my early training in Bancroftian filariasis, so I was more of a parasitologist than a virologist at that time. But I took a job at the Calcutta School of Tropical Medicine in a Johns Hopkins funded program. And so I studied filariasis in Calcutta in the late 60s and the early 70s. I was slated to go back to Johns Hopkins, which is a world renowned university, but a fellow Scott Halstead came through Calcutta one day and offered me a job at a new medical school that he was building or starting in Hawaii. And, that sort of ensured that I could go back to Asia because by that time I'd sort of fallen in love with Asia and India and Pacific area. So I left Johns Hopkins and joined a new venture in Hawaii. Just about that same time, though, dengue was reintroduced into the Pacific Islands for the first
Mm.
time after World War II. And so there were epidemics that were popping up in a lot of those islands in the South Pacific. We had no good assay systems for dengue. So one of my first research projects was to work with Leon Rosen to develop a new method to isolate dengue viruses. And we used mosquitoes. We actually gave mosquitoes injection with human sera,
Mm.
and it was a very highly sensitive method of isolating viruses. So we began using these methods to study the epidemics in the South Pacific and a number of the epidemics. So this book, the reason for this poster was that I spent a lot of time in the first half of the 70s kicking around the South Pacific from island to island studying epidemic dengue. And then I wanted to put the methods to use in areas where dengue was more of a public health problem, a serious public health problem. So I uh, went to Indonesia. I took leave of absence from the university and actually had to join the Navy for a couple of years to go to Indonesia to work in their Namru 2 laboratory. So I was spent the last half of the 70s in Indonesia, and from there I was hooked on dengue,
Yeah.
and from there I joined the Centers for Disease Control and started the dengue branch in Puerto Rico in 1981, and then moved to Fort Collins and then back to Asia. So
Wow. Now, by that time, had you actually experienced the disease yourself yet? I think you've gotten it 3 times. If maybe I
yeah,
think that.
I've had it at least 3 times, probably more. But the first infection that I had was with one of the viruses I isolated from Tahiti in one of the epidemics,
Mm.
and we were trying to study the relationship between viremia, the amount of virus circulating in the blood, with the amount that it takes to infect mosquitoes that feed on an individual. And of course, we those days we couldn't use human volunteers, um, so we used monkeys instead, non-human
Mhm.
primates. And so I would infect the monkeys by feeding infected mosquitoes on them, and then I would take a blood sample every day and I would feed mosquitoes on them every day so
Wow.
I could measure how much virus it took to infect mosquitoes. But a lot of those mosquitoes I used sometimes didn't like to bite the monkey. They preferred me over the monkey. And so one of them, or maybe more than one, but one day one of them probed me when I had my hand over the net to try and attract him down to the net before I placed it on the monkey. And one of them probed me. They didn't take a blood meal, but this is where I first learned that you don't need blood sample. All you need is for the mosquito to probe you, and they inject
Wow.
virus. 5 days to the day after that happened, I came down with a fulminant case of dengue, high fever. I had over 8 logs of virus circulating in my blood, and so I had one of my colleagues bleed me every day and feed mosquitoes on me every day. And so we were
You
able
were
to
taking
measure.
advantage.
So that was the first human volunteer.
Oh my
Anyway, we
God.
were able to show that the relationship between people who had really high viremias and mosquito infection. And I was very sick, and that was my first dengue infection. I was very sick. The people at the university medical school thought I had malaria. Um, so I was, that was the worst. Then I had dengue again in Indonesia. It was really almost just a mild, non-specific febrile illness that would never have been diagnosed as dengue if I wouldn't have taken a blood sample and tested myself. And then I had infection in Puerto Rico, which was the same, very mild illness. And the only reason we knew it was dengue is that I took blood samples and had them
Mm.
tested. The same thing happened with West Nile when we were studying West Nile in the U.S. Um, I was infected with West Nile too, but I just sort of uh, didn't feel good a couple of days, and so I thought, well, I'll
Yeah.
have them take a blood sample, and lo and behold, I had West Nile infection.
Hmm.
So that it was where I really kind of uh, got the concept that there is cross-protective immunity among the flaviviruses. They don't protect against infection, but it does downregulate clinical illness. Yeah.
That's so interesting. Um, let's talk a little bit about what distinguishes dengue from some of the other mosquito-borne ailments. I didn't know that about the. You don't. I think my memory of malaria, for example, is that the mosquito has to spend more time on you than just you. Is there a different transmission pattern or phenomenon with dengue than there are with other mosquito-borne viruses?
Uh, Not really. All of the mosquito-borne viruses have very complex transmission cycles that relates to number one, the mosquito species that transmits them, and number
Yeah.
two, the host, the natural host that allows continuous transmission of the virus. People used to call those reservoir hosts, but we found that looking at all the arboviruses, there's no vertebrate host that really fits the definition of a reservoir. So
Mm,
if I don't use the word reservoir, that's why. But
mm,
malaria is transmitted by an anopheline mosquito
right.
and several anopheline mosquitoes. Basically, is a rural disease as opposed to an urban disease that dengue is. The mosquitoes that transmit it are night biting mosquitoes, whereas and so bed nets work for prevention. Aedes aegypti is a day biting mosquito that transmits dengue, and so bed nets don't do much good in prevention there. Um, Culex mosquitoes that transmit a lot of the encephalitis viruses are generally uh, night biters and are dawn to dusk type of feeders. So there's a lot of ecological differences in the mosquito biology and the hosts that maintain. Um, Dengue is primarily an urban mosquito. Interestingly, there is a malaria in India is also an urban disease, and it's because the mosquito that transmits it is Anopheles stevensii, which is has very similar ecology to Aedes aegypti.
Mm,
That mosquito is going to cause problems down the road because it has recently been introduced into a bunch of countries around the world, including Africa. And so once it starts transmitting malaria in urban areas, malaria is going to become a bigger public health problem. And the
mm.
silver lining to that is that if that's the case, it'll probably mean more money for control of dengue because malaria has a lot of money, dengue does
Uh,
not.
that's an interesting point too. Let's talk about that a little bit historically. When I look at the data for dengue, the global mortality data is pretty low. I mean, it's not doesn't mean I'm not saying it's not a serious problem, but it seems way lower than let's say malaria. Yet it's considered extremely important. How much of that is about lost sort of disability adjusted days, sickness days? Should how worried should people be about dengue compared to some of the other
Well,
ailments?
there's no question that dengue is much less important than malaria
Yeah,
in terms of both uh, persistent illness and in terms of death. You're right, dengue has a very low case fatality rate. The thing that makes dengue more important is the fact that it occurs in major epidemics with
right.
thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of people infected, and that has a tremendous economic impact. has an impact on just about all aspects of life. And it makes people, as you alluded to in starting this discussion, makes them very sick.
Right.
So they lose a lot of work or schooling in the process and so you multiply that by the tens of thousands of cases that may occur during an epidemic. It becomes a very important public health problem. Um, the other thing that makes this even more complicated is, and this probably also occurs with malaria, but no one has really studied it very well, is that um, all dengue viruses are not created equally.
Hmm.
As dengue viruses move through populations, they're maintained in large urban centers with basically silent transmission. Most people that get dengue are either asymptomatic or have very mild illness that never gets diagnosed as dengue. And so it allows the virus to cycle in large urban areas. But I think through positive selection, through random mutations, and drift, strains of dengue virus emerge that have greater fitness, greater epidemic potential. They're associated with higher viremia levels, more severe disease, and higher rates of transmission. And that's when we have the epidemics. If that virus emerges in a population that has a high susceptible human population to the particular serotype, there are a lot of mosquitoes around, and the weather climate is appropriate, then you're going to have the epidemics. And so dengue has this ability to cause major epidemics, which and it's estimated, if you've read Messina's papers and some of the Hague Group's papers, they estimate that there's 400 million dengue infections a year in the world, and probably 100 million of those are symptomatic.
That's, yeah.
I would guess the majority of the others, they say they're asymptomatic, but uh, that's really not true. A lot of them are just mildly symptomatic that never gets diagnosed as dengue.
Yeah. You said something earlier, and it's in your research as well, is that one reason dengue is particularly important is because of its urban habitat preference, I guess. And when you take that against what's happened with human civilization over the last 30 or years or so, 50 years, we've become an urban species at the same time. We humanity transitioned to a majority urban species, I think, within the past decade, and with more and more of that. So how is that a big driver of why you and others are so concerned? Those
It,
overlapping.
it's a
Uh,
major driver, Andrew. To really fully understand what happened, and if I can take a minute and go back and talk about some of the history here, we came out of World War II um, with dengue viruses spread all over Asia, really, by the troops in the war. They spread the mosquitoes all over and the viruses all over. But after World War II, those people had been in war for a decade or more, and population truly exploded. Coincident with that was economic growth, tremendous economic growth, primarily again in Southeast Asian countries. And that led to migration of people from rural areas into the city to find work. And that led to urban slums where people lived in areas with inadequate housing, inadequate water, sewage, waste management, which created ideal conditions for the mosquitoes, which then allowed a lot of transmission. And about the same time, or a little bit later, but in the early 1970s, probably most of your audience don't remember this, but In the 60s and early 70s, most of the transportation of people was by boat or by certainly not jet airplanes. And the jet
Right.
airplane came on the line, Boeing, I think, in the late 60s, 69, 70. But really, it was in the 70s when jet air travel really took off. I did a investigation some years ago and looked at the level of people flying on airplanes from the 1950s through that time. It was the early 2000s, the mid 2000s. And in 1950, on average, every year, about 50 million people flew somewhere on an airplane.
Yeah.
Uh, this year, it's estimated over 5 billion people will fly somewhere by airplane, and a lot of those people are going to cities where that are endemic for dengue and other infectious agents that have potential of secondary transmission. So there's a constant introduction of viruses into areas that are permissive for transmission.
Wow. So the viruses are getting mixed. The mosquitoes, they're there, the habitat's there, and the people are there. And
Well,
you did this.
can I
Yeah,
just add one thing to that?
of
That
course. Yeah.
one of the reasons we're seeing such a dramatic increase in epidemics, not only the frequency but the magnitude of epidemics, is increased transmission. The more you increase transmission and have virus turnover in these urban centers, the greater the probability that a strain will emerge that has greater fitness and greater epidemic potential. And of course, then with all of the air travel, the greater probability that those viruses will move around the world. And that's
Yeah.
exactly what's happened in the past 30 years.
Wow. So it's a dynamic situation. This is something in other arenas I've covered before. It's hard for people to understand sometimes. Like for flooding, we think of there was a paper in 2005 warning hydrologists away from the idea of a static sense of what's normal. And stationarity is the word, stationarity, the death of stationarity. And what you're describing is that the virus is in flux. And of course, the dynamics around us, the sociological, societal dynamics are in flux. So you're not fighting the same problem each decade.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things that really gets to me is all the public health officials and, of course, the climate people want to blame this on climate.
Hmm.
And climate is important. There's no doubt about it. The weather is important. But if we focus on all of our efforts on carbon, controlling the amount of carbon, a lot of that money could be funneled into public health programs that we could use to control these diseases. And yes, climate change will occur. We won't get into why or how, but it's going to occur one way or another. But we can
Right.
prevent these diseases if we had the resources and the will to do so.
Yeah, I want to walk through this paper you wrote that came out in 2011 that really caught my attention and still does. And it relates to the climate change hyper focus. Here I am. I've written about climate change half of my life since 1988, but I do see it overemphasized sometimes. But in this paper, you had this graph. This map only goes through 2011, but we were discussing the other day, um, if anything, the spread since 2011 in that part of the Americas is higher. And I look at this 1930s, from 1930s to 1970s, something big changed. And then for Aedes aegypti, the main carrier. And then from 1970 through 2011 and onward, something big changed. Can you walk us through this context just for the Americas?
Sure. Yeah, you look at the 1930s map, that was a approximate distribution of Aedes aegypti mosquitoes that transmitted yellow fever and dengue in the area. and there was very little control going on then at that time. Um, After World War II, one of the most successful programs we've seen was initiated by the Pan American Health Organization, funded by the U.S., and it was the Aedes aegypti eradication program that was primarily aimed at controlling epidemic yellow fever, which has a much higher case fatality rate than dengue. And basically, Aedes aegypti was eliminated from 22 or 23 countries over a period of from 1946 through the end of the 50s, into the 60s, I guess. But that essentially stopped epidemic yellow fever and dengue in its tracks. There was no epidemic of yellow fever from I think 1942 on. There were sporadic outbreaks of dengue in the Caribbean area that still green Venezuela and the Caribbean islands and the southern United States never eradicated the mosquito, but it stopped the transmission. It basically, and the epidemics in the Caribbean and in the transmission in the United States is basically fed by the larger cities where these viruses are maintained. Um, so in the 1970s, early 1970s, because we were so successful in all of the others, we had malaria eradication program was working, smallpox. We had antibiotics, we had vaccines, we had insecticides, DDT at the time, and so infectious diseases. This is why the Surgeon General and Sir MacFarlane Burnet in the 1960s declared the war on infectious diseases won. And what that did is it terminated this program, the Aedes aegypti eradication program, but it also redirected a lot of money away from prevention and control of infectious diseases to other more important public health programs, primarily chronic diseases. So from the early 1970s on, essentially the program stopped. And WHO, the World Health Organization, in their wisdom, actually merged all vector-borne disease control programs. So malaria, dengue, leishmaniasis, Chagas was all lumped into one program. Because malaria was the most important of those diseases, most of the people who were kept on the programs were malariologists. All of the Aedes people, the others basically were either fired or let go when their term of employment ended. And so essentially during the 70s and 80s, there was nothing going on in terms of control. We had also, you'd be interested in this, Andrew, you're probably aware of it. In the late 60s, they developed what we call ultra low volume spraying of insecticides. And they did a few trials in the Americas as well as in Asia that showed that it controlled Aedes aegypti very effectively. However, their methods were flawed, and we've subsequently shown that it has little impact on the natural population or on transmission. But anyway, that was what control became, and it still is in many countries. You hear about control, they're spraying insecticides. When you hear about an epidemic of dengue, what do you see in the media? People are spraying insecticides. The easy way out. Anyway, so the third map here in 2011, and it's even worse today, is the results of no control and the redistribution, geographic spread of Aedes aegypti into the areas of Central and South America. Coincident with this was also as you pointed out a minute ago, the urbanization of the Americas. And by the 1990s, something like 70% of people in the South America lived in urban areas. So, and that of course increased the the probability of increased epidemic dengue, because at the same time, increased air travel moved a lot of viruses from Asia into the American region, and the result was continuous epidemics. Now, interestingly, we haven't had any more epidemics of yellow fever. We've had some epizootics in recent years, but the virus has never moved back into the urban area in an Aedes aegypti transmission cycle, Aedes aegypti humans. And we're not really sure why. It's all speculation. My guess is that the reason for that is yellow fever virus has been maintained in monkeys in the Amazon forest region for 70 years or so.
Huh.
And basically, it has totally become adapted to a monkey, Haemogogus sabethes transmission cycle. And these are very different mosquitoes than Aedes aegypti. So the virus gets introduced into urban areas now, but it's rare to see urban transmission by Aedes aegypti. I think it's just a matter of time, though, until yellow fever virus changes like dengue does to develop a strain that has greater fitness and greater epidemic potential.
So that could be coming.
That would make dengue pale by comparison.
Wow. So I guess that kind of gets back to what you said about the irony of what was assumed back in the 1960s, that infectious disease was, the war was won. And with something like yellow fever, like maybe there's an impression somewhere. I think I had a card when I got a yellow fever vaccine in the 1980s, but I don't think about it.
Yeah, that's one of the problems. One of the worries that we've had and people have had for decades, actually back to the turn of the 20th century, is the introduction of yellow fever into Asia, where there's approximately 2 billion people that live in areas that are at risk for a disease like that. But yellow fever has never been documented in Asian countries until 2016. 2016, there were 11 Chinese that were working in Angola during a yellow fever epidemic, and they got sick and they got on an airplane, went back to China, and they were confirmed as yellow fever. Luckily, they went back to areas where, and this was in early March, so it was still cold, and there's areas where it was temperate, where Aedes aegypti didn't occur, and so there was no secondary transmission. But that's the first introduction of yellow fever into Asia that we know of. It doesn't mean it's the only one, but what it does is it underscores the ecological conditions of today that makes it highly probable that sooner or later that virus is going to get introduced, and it most likely will cause major epidemics. The other thing that probably prevents this from has prevented this from happening is I alluded to earlier, the cross-protective immunity among flaviviruses. And so there was a study done in the 1970s that showed that people who had been or monkeys that had been infected with dengue had a much milder illness and lower viremia levels than monkeys that were naive and infected with yellow fever virus. So it's possible that there is some cross protection. It doesn't prevent against infection, but it may protect against severe disease.
Wow. I want to swing back to climate briefly and then get into what's happening going forward, the Dengue Alliance, and also what individuals or communities can do to limit the risk. But there was as we said earlier, the climate change tends to kind of suck up a lot of the oxygen in the room these days, because it is so important, and it's, as you said, it's linked to funding as well. And I want to show just a recent example of how this plays out. the World Health Organization just this year issued another report: spike in dengue cases due to global warming, warns WHO, and this is a UN release. Would you say that's gone beyond the where the science is?
Very definitely gone beyond, way beyond. Um, you know, like I say, public health officials love to blame global warming because it's something they can't control, and you can't blame them for failing in their job of protecting the public health. This goes back to the early to mid 90s when climate change became a major issue. I was on the 2001 IPCC as the lead author of the health chapter, and I was fighting on a daily basis to tone down the rhetoric of the effect of climate change, or at that time, global warming, on infectious diseases. But if you look today, if you submit a grant, say to NIH or wherever, to WHO, if you've got a climate change component in it, you'll almost certainly get funded. If you don't
Right.
have a climate change component in it, you'll almost certainly not get funded. And so I think that what we're doing is people are talking about global warming and climate change simply to get funding for their research. A
Mm.
lot of it, Jeremy Farrar, you saw the WHO article, I think it was last week, where Jeremy Farrar, who's now the chief scientist at WHO, actually said that the U.S. and Europe are that we're going to see epidemic dengue because of global warming. And I know Jeremy very well. I've worked with him for years, and I can't believe he believes that. I think he's bending to the pressure. Excuse me,
Yeah, yeah, no problem. We can pause for a second.
I'm gonna hang up on him
Okay.
right. Anyway, without question, as I've said repeatedly, weather and temperature, climate are important, but they're not the principal driver. And I think that there's so much hype out there. There's a lot of things driving it, and I think one of them is that people do it to get funded.
Well, that's unfortunate because it can take away focus from things that can be done on the ground in communities to reduce the risk, these drivers of risk, exposure, and vulnerability.
Yeah, I think it well, I've been on my stump about this for
Mm.
the better part of 20 years now, of the whole issue of climate change that has been driven by models that basically are focused on one parameter, and that's temperature.
Right.
And the transmission cycle of these diseases are very complicated, and a lot of things influence sex transmission dynamics. And so, if you have a model that focuses on one of those parameters, it can be very misleading. And I think that's exactly what happens.
Mm.
Um, Along these lines, Andrew, I think that a lot of people don't realize that in the U.S. and Europe we had major epidemics of dengue, of yellow fever, of malaria, and occasionally other vector-borne diseases in the 1700s, in the 1800s, and in the early 1900s.
Right.
We eliminated those diseases by the 1950s. We didn't do it by eliminating the mosquitoes. We did it with higher living standards, better housing, better water management systems, better
Right.
sewage, waste management, better public health. And so, when people like Jeremy say that we're going to have dengue is going to become a problem in places like the United States and Europe, it could well be. But if they do, it'll because the living standards tank, and we allow those slums to develop in our cities, which is happening in
Wow.
some of them for sure.
So
But I think it's not a matter of so much the temperature as it is uh, adequate housing, adequate water
yeah,
supply, adequate sewage and waste management.
that's so interesting. So you kind of mentioned two different dynamics. One was health organizations, uh, or historically would be thrilled to find another cause outside their responsibility for disease, and then this issue of funding and finance, and I think it's even more than that. It's just being part of the discourse. Climate, the climate treaty talks and everything are really deep, and most environmental journalists have, for example, have a harder time writing about those background issues you described, water storage, than about global warming and fossil fuel companies. And both can be very important, but mixing them up can really, I think, be problematic.
Yeah, I did an interview a few weeks back, maybe a month or so ago, um, with a lady who was writing a paper, and I haven't seen the paper. She hadn't shared it with the final with me, but she wanted some quotes from me and discussions. We had a fairly long discussion, and I explained a lot of this to her, and I thought she would incorporate some of this background into her paper. Well, when she sent me, and I offered to fact check to make sure she got it right, when she got her first draft, and so she sent it to me, and it was totally misleading.
Hmm.
And so I asked her to remove my quotes because I didn't want to be associated with her paper.
Hmm.
I don't know whether she did or not,
Oh boy.
but that's it's sort of the problem. If more scientists would do that and really take a look at what people are writing, and in terms of Jeremy Farrar, I'm not sure whether he actually said that or whether whoever wrote that article interpreted that way and wanted him to say that.
Yeah. Well, I can reach out and try to check to see how that played out.
Now you can tell him that I don't believe him.
I will. Let's get on to this issue or opportunity to do the things necessary to make this mosquito less comfortable in our environments. Um, I had a misimpression that, in fact, I think I tweeted about this a few years ago. Oh, it was when Zika was in the headlines about the value of social media for communities to identify standing water, puddles or outdoor trash. And then we were talking, you and I were talking a few days ago. You mentioned that there's some misimpressions about where dengue, where the Aedes aegypti mosquito really feels happiest, and the things to really focus on for this particular threat. So, what is the misimpression, even that I had, and then what are the things that communities really need to do?
Well, you know, Aedes aegypti is a very controllable mosquito, primarily because it has adapted to humans. It's a highly domesticated mosquito. It loves to live in the houses with humans, loves to feed on humans, it loves to lay its eggs in water storage containers that humans keep in their house. That's why it's important to get piped water supply into houses that's reliable.
Hmm.
Uh, but a lot of the media information you hear, they talk about groundwater. Yeah, occasionally you can find these mosquitoes in groundwater, but in the big scheme of things, it's important. If you get rid of the stored water containers or control the stored water containers in and around houses, then you're going to control the transmission. I always use Singapore as an example of how this can be done. When I first visited Singapore in the early 1970s, late 60s, early 1970s, it had just become independent. It was a very poor Southeast Asian country. Had about 1.5 million people is all, very small. But they had outbreaks of dengue hemorrhagic fever at that time. A fellow by the name of Chiang Kai-lok, actually then, and Daniel Wong, who was Director General of the Public Health, Ministry of Public Health at that time, developed a program to control the mosquitoes, to control dengue through mosquito control. And it was a highly integrated program that used a combination of source reduction, community education, and some spraying. And they were very effectively controlled the mosquito. At the same time, they started a program of urban renewal.
Mm.
This started in the late 1960s, the early 70s. And over a period of now 40 something years, they have transformed Singapore into a city that is not attractive to Aedes aegypti. Mosquito populations are very low, and so a combination of mosquito control using effective methods and using well-trained people, combined with urban development, is, I think, the way forward. And we are using that model to recommend future control of dengue in a Lancet Commission
Right.
program I'm involved with. And basically, we're advising or recommending a two-fold approach. Number one, to use current and novel mosquito control methods to control the mosquito and prevent epidemics now, but start a program of urban renewal and develop housing, water systems, sewage systems that are not conducive for mosquito breeding. And yes, it'll take a few decades to achieve that. But
Mm.
if countries or cities would do this, we're focusing on at the city level. But if cities would do this, then I think we would control not only dengue but a number of other mosquito-borne diseases.
And that alliance is a new effort, right?
Yeah, the alliance. I'm not part of that, and but what they're proposing is what we've been proposing for years, is using an integrated approach
Right.
to which combines mosquito control with vaccines, drugs, better treatment, case management, etc.
Hmm.
So it's really nothing new in terms of the approach. It's a new program. I wish them luck.
And is there a way to think of the investments across the range of public health, how much higher dengue justifiably should be, in a world of limited resources, not to mention with coronavirus and everything else on everyone's plate and pandemic risk reduction? What, how far below the investment how far below is the current investment to what it really ideally should be, would you think?
It's very low, but let me just get on my stump again, because dengue control in the 1950s and early 60s, when we were so successful, dengue control was a top-down program,
Mm.
as was a lot of our public health programs at that time. We basically, governments developed the programs, and in South America, where we were so successful, a lot of the countries had dictators, or at least highly controlled governments. The people were more cooperative, But if they didn't toe the line, they were fined. And this was also what Singapore did: is they fined people if they found mosquitoes breeding in their property.
Right.
So these top-down programs were so effective. Then they replaced that with magic bullet insecticide spraying, and so we end up with a population, global population, if you will, in the 1980s and 90s and into the 21st century that have depended on government to do all of their control. And if you look at the countries around the world that are endemic for dengue, you find that very few of them put any of their health dollars, national health dollars, into dengue control. If you
Yeah.
ask the ministers of health in those countries to name the 10 top public health problems, dengue is always in that list. But yet they put absolutely little of their public health dollars into controlling it. And so I've said for years that we'll never have sustainable control until national governments bite the bullet and say we're going to allocate some of our funds to control this disease. And so I think part of the problem is lack of funding at the national level.
Mm.
Of course, we need more funding at the international level. And here a few years ago, I actually proposed developing a global fund for Aedes transmitted diseases like dengue, chikungunya, Zika, yellow fever, to actually help governments get programs started with the condition that they will then transition into fully funding these down the road. And there's where a problem lies. Countries get used to the largesse from international funding agencies to buy their vaccines, to control their mosquitoes, and so forth. So I think we need to have a whole new paradigm of how we fund uh, these programs.
Yeah. One thing that came to mind, and then we're going to close out fairly soon, as you were speaking, is when you have a particular set of investments that work for one category of diseases, let's say the Aedes carried diseases, that make sense for other reasons, and that the basically the urban renewal menu that you described comes with climate resilience, um, other waterborne disease reduction. You have a host of benefits that can accrue from those basic
What I
priorities.
call environmental improvement environment. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's a hard thing for people to target. Yeah, as and I guess even international funding, if it's WHO, if it's like the World Bank, well, actually, the World Bank, I think, historically has understood that if you fund basic development, you're funding risk reduction for a lot of these things.
But
But
Andrew, don't you think that part of this is that we've raised a whole generation of people that are dependent on other people to fund their public health, to control their public health programs, and people who expect a quick fix. They want a
Mhm.
magic bullet solution. You know, a story. I'll just divert a little bit here, but it's related to this. When I joined CDC in 1980 and started the dengue program in Puerto Rico, I was charged with developing a program for dengue control, which
Mm.
I had no idea about at that time. But I actually then CDC AIDS HIV hit the world, and all of CDC's money went to funding AIDS programs, and so I was left high and dry. So I
Mm.
went to Rotary International, and I talked them into funding a community-based program focused really on educating the the population. But the feedback I got from the Rotarians was, we can't do this. We can't. We want something quick. We want a vaccine. If you give us a vaccine, we'll be happy to fund it. But we don't do community-based control. And but that's basically the mentality of a lot of people in this world. They want that. They want that quick fix, something easy,
Yeah.
and none of this is easy.
No, and this takes me back to a lot of the reporting I've done on climate vulnerability reduction, the vulnerability reduction, which is different than controlling climate change. It is a key need. It's very undervalued and underemphasized for the same reasons. It's
Yeah,
because the drivers of vulnerability are poverty, homeless, lack of good public housing. There are these big, slow moving issues, racial injustice, marginalization, uh, and it feels very resonant what you're saying.
yeah. The that you have resource poor countries, a lot of them that have, they're used to deforestation. You end up with denuded hills that then when you get a little bit of an excessive rain, you have tremendous flooding, and basically a lot of damage caused by um, other factors, not but resulting from climate or weather, but
Right.
it's the real damage is due to other factors that have been going on for years.
Yeah. In fact, I'm going to show a card. I made a slide years ago when Zika. I did a training module for Latin American journalists on when Zika was emerging, just on how to think about these kinds of threats. And there's a slide that I showed, I think is worth showing here. Um, let's see if you can see it. The thing we care about is risk, right?
Yeah,
If whether it's climate risk or disease risk, and it's a function of the hazard, exposure, and vulnerability.
yeah,
And again, with climate change, all the focus is on the hazard, how much of a hurricane is changing because of global warming, et cetera. But when you really look carefully, you go down this list. Exposure, of course, is how many people, pathways. Um, that's population, urbanization, mobility, and then vulnerability is a knob you really can turn. You can lower it or raise it depending on how much we invest in poverty alleviation, how much education, and the like. Whether it's so that I almost think this should be like a pocket card that
yeah.
someone
I
actually
would, I say this another way, but essentially the same thing that you're talking about here is our problem is not climate change; it's environmental change.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
that's the vulnerability is we have done so much to affect the environment that increases the vulnerability to just about anything we do. And so if it was me with this slide, I would move vulnerability over where hazard is and put hazard last.
Right, right. Uh, yeah, I agree with you completely. In fact, I have another one that's kind of got that structure to it. So we can work on that. I'll make a version of this slide that's more. I want to keep
I
updating it.
sent you a couple of papers yesterday that you'd asked me, is there any papers on this? But about flooding and hurricanes and transmission
Oh,
of these
right. Yeah.
diseases. And I don't know whether you looked them up, but one of them has well, there were two of them on epidemics in the Caribbean, but one of them was during the epidemic of Hurricane Georges in Puerto Rico in 1998. And I don't know whether you got that paper or not, but we have a graph in there where you see the increased dengue transmission during the epidemic. Hurricane Georges hit, and it just stops transmission in
So, and that's
its
so
track.
counterintuitive
Yeah, and
initially.
yeah, so it's when hurricanes occur, one of the first things the press jump on and ministries of health jump on, we're going to see increased dengue or vector-borne diseases, It ain't so.
And tell us why. I think you were saying it relates to
Well,
washing out the.
yeah, the reason why is the hurricane and all of the wind, the damage that's caused by the hurricane actually washes out or destroys all the breeding sites, and it kills most of the adult mosquitoes that are infected and transmitting, and so it takes weeks to months for the mosquito population to build back up and then get transmission started again. And so that's why you see after the hurricane, transmission comes back to a baseline level, but it doesn't come back to the epidemic level.
That's so
The
interesting.
same thing happens with flooding. You know, the flooding for other mosquitoes that occurs, it does the same, has the same effect.
Wow. So it's really important not to jump to simple vistas in thinking about this. So
Everybody wants simplicity.
yeah, I wanted to close out with also a look at some of the idea that there CRISPR or there'll be a techno fix basically, which is I think gets at your point about simplicity. Um, but it is there are some things that can be done with these technologies now that are emerging that are pretty interesting. There's a big debate emerging between Europe and Africa over um, the potential to eliminate certain mosquitoes species using CRISPR gene editing technology. So, and the New York Times just did a big series on mosquito-borne disease. Is there a chance of a bit, sort of a targeted uh, high-tech solution?
Well, I certainly, if you talk about disease control, yes, I think we do have the tools, we have the potential tools, and the know-how to control these diseases, and we'll never eradicate the diseases.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, these diseases all have uh, vertebrate host, vertebrate transmission cycles in the zoonosis realm. And so eradication, I think, is out. But I think we have the technology, the know how to control uh, epidemics or prevent epidemics. And if we can prevent epidemics and diseases like dengue, yellow fever, then we've basically controlled the public health problem.
Right.
In the same way, I think malaria, they've been very successful. So I think, yeah, with a combination use of good mosquito control practices, vaccines, better diagnosis and case management, better environmental management, and with the help of the people who live in the houses where a lot of these diseases are transmitted. So, education is critical. You've got to educate the people. You've got to educate them to have some responsibility for helping the government. So it requires, if we're going to be successful, it's going to require a partnership between the people who live in the communities where it's occurring, the all of the community organizations, churches, businesses, public health officials.
Right.
It's a total community effort if we're going to do it. And, if people get tired of having major epidemics, maybe we'll achieve it. But, I say people want a quick fix. And so vaccines are going to be a key component to a lot of these diseases. But they alone won't do it. We're going to have to combine environmental management and mosquito control along with it.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your time, Duane Gubler, Dr. Duane Gubler, more than a half century committed to understanding and mitigating illnesses transmitted by mosquitoes and with a particular focus on dengue. And I do not recommend, for those of you who have not had it, trying it out. It's memorable. Let's put it that way. It's a memorable experience, and it does occasionally kill. And there's a lot of mythology running around, and if we can help dispel it through conversations here to target the useful pathways to risk reduction, I'll be at this again. And Dr. Gubler and I discussed the idea of a future show with some of his colleagues in Singapore, which has been, again, which has built a city that's not a mosquito city. And it's not all about spraying. It's about a holistic approach to controlling this little insect that has such a big impact on humans. Again, for those who don't know, lions and tigers and sharks pale beside the mosquito in terms of human peril. So thanks, Duane Gubler from Duke University for being on Sustain What. Anyone watching this can share it after we're done. The video persists on all the different platforms. I'll be writing up a version of some of this key ideas on my Substack column with the same name. And I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
It's been my pleasure, Andrew. It's always good to get the word out. I hope it does some good.
It certainly can't hurt. So